Question 1. Comparative studies suggest that the effectiveness of a DDI assessment is significantly influenced by the chosen approach to risk evaluation. Considering a scenario where a firm is developing a new product with novel technological components, which of the following approaches to assessing potential DDI risks would be most aligned with robust regulatory compliance and ethical best practices? Option A. A risk assessment where risk scores are assigned subjectively based on the perceived severity of potential DDI events, without a standardized methodology. Option B. A risk assessment that postpones the evaluation of DDI events involving new technologies or uncertain outcomes until they become more clearly defined. Option C. A comprehensive risk assessment that systematically identifies potential DDI events, evaluates their likelihood and impact using a defined risk matrix, and prioritizes them for mitigation. Option D. A risk assessment that primarily focuses on DDI events that have occurred with similar products in the past, assuming that novel risks are unlikely to emerge. The correct answer is C. A comprehensive risk assessment that systematically identifies potential DDI events, evaluates their likelihood and impact using a defined risk matrix, and prioritizes them for mitigation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the DDI assessment framework, while designed to identify and mitigate risks, requires subjective interpretation and judgment. The challenge lies in balancing the need for a thorough assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, and ensuring that the chosen approach aligns with the overarching objectives of the DDI assessment, which is to understand and manage potential impacts. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying potential DDI events, assessing their likelihood and impact, and then prioritizing them based on a defined risk matrix. This aligns with best professional practice because it ensures a comprehensive and objective evaluation of risks. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial services or product development, often mandate such a structured risk assessment process to ensure due diligence and accountability. This approach demonstrates a commitment to proactive risk management, a core ethical principle in many professions. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to focus solely on DDI events that have historically occurred, neglecting emerging or novel risks. This fails to meet regulatory expectations for forward-looking risk assessment and can lead to a false sense of security. Ethically, it represents a failure of due diligence and a disregard for potential future harm. Another incorrect approach is to assign arbitrary risk scores without a clear methodology or justification. This undermines the credibility of the DDI assessment and makes it difficult to prioritize mitigation efforts effectively. It can also lead to regulatory scrutiny for a lack of robust internal controls and a failure to demonstrate a sound risk management framework. A third incorrect approach is to defer the assessment of complex or uncertain DDI events indefinitely. This creates a significant blind spot and can result in unmanaged risks materializing. It is a failure to adhere to the principle of timely and comprehensive risk evaluation, which is often a regulatory requirement and an ethical imperative to protect stakeholders. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach DDI assessments by first understanding the specific context and objectives. They should then adopt a structured methodology that includes clear criteria for identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing risks. Documentation is crucial at every step to demonstrate the rigor of the process and to facilitate future reviews and audits. When faced with uncertainty, professionals should err on the side of caution, seeking expert advice or employing scenario planning to explore potential outcomes. The decision-making process should be guided by regulatory requirements, ethical principles, and a commitment to robust risk management. Question 2. Assessment of the potential risks associated with a new direct debiting instruction (DDI) product requires a structured approach. Which of the following methodologies best aligns with a robust and compliant risk assessment process for such a product? Option A. An assessment that exclusively examines the most technically complex or novel features of the DDI product, assuming other aspects are inherently low risk. Option B. A risk assessment that relies solely on historical data from similar DDI products, without considering the specific nuances and innovations of the new offering. Option C. A comprehensive review of every conceivable risk, regardless of its probability or potential severity, to ensure no aspect is overlooked. Option D. a tiered risk assessment that prioritizes potential risks based on their likelihood and potential impact, focusing detailed analysis on the highest risk areas. Correct answer is D. A tiered risk assessment that prioritizes potential risks based on their likelihood and potential impact, focusing detailed analysis on the highest risk areas. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the DDI assessor to balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resource allocation. The assessor must identify and evaluate potential risks associated with a new DDI product without becoming bogged down in exhaustive, potentially unproductive analysis. The core of the challenge lies in applying a risk-based approach that is both comprehensive enough to meet regulatory expectations and efficient enough to be actionable. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes risks based on their likelihood and potential impact, aligning with the principles of effective risk management and regulatory compliance. By focusing on the most significant risks, the assessor ensures that resources are directed towards areas where they will have the greatest impact in mitigating harm. This systematic, tiered approach is often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory frameworks that emphasize proportionality and a risk-sensitive methodology. It demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and a proactive stance in safeguarding consumers and market integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most complex or novel aspects of the DDI product, while neglecting more common or potentially impactful risks, would be professionally unacceptable. This failure could lead to regulatory scrutiny for not conducting a sufficiently comprehensive assessment. Another incorrect approach, which involves a superficial review of all potential risks without adequate depth or prioritization, would also be problematic. This could result in a false sense of security, where significant risks are overlooked due to a lack of detailed analysis, potentially leading to consumer harm and subsequent regulatory sanctions for inadequate due diligence. A third incorrect approach, which relies entirely on historical data without considering the unique characteristics of the new DDI product, fails to acknowledge that past performance is not always indicative of future results, especially with innovative financial products. This could lead to an underestimation of novel risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the scope and objectives of the DDI assessment. This involves identifying all potential risk categories relevant to the product and its target market. Subsequently, a qualitative and quantitative assessment of the likelihood and impact of each identified risk should be performed. This assessment should inform a prioritization of risks, allowing the assessor to focus resources on those with the highest potential for adverse outcomes. Regular review and iteration of the risk assessment are also crucial, especially as new information becomes available or market conditions change. Question 3. When evaluating candidates for a leadership development program using the DDI assessment framework, which approach best ensures a fair and accurate identification of potential, moving beyond superficial indicators? Option A. A comprehensive assessment utilizing multiple data points, including behavioral interviews, psychometric assessments, and simulations, to evaluate a broad range of competencies and future potential. Option B. Giving preference to individuals who have been with the organization for a significant period, as their tenure suggests loyalty and institutional knowledge. Option C. Focusing on candidates who have explicitly expressed a strong desire for leadership positions and have outlined ambitious career goals. Option D. Prioritizing candidates who have consistently exceeded expectations in their current roles, as this demonstrates a proven ability to perform. Correct answer is A. A comprehensive assessment utilizing multiple data points, including behavioral interviews, psychometric assessments, and simulations, to evaluate a broad range of competencies and future potential. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the DDI assessment process requires a nuanced understanding of an individual's capabilities and potential, moving beyond superficial observations. It demands a rigorous, evidence-based approach to identify individuals who can genuinely contribute to the organization's strategic objectives and leadership pipeline. The challenge lies in avoiding biases, ensuring fairness, and aligning the assessment with the organization's specific needs and regulatory obligations, which in this context are governed by the DDI assessment framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, multifaceted evaluation. This involves utilizing a variety of assessment tools and methods, such as behavioral interviews, psychometric testing, and simulations, to gather a holistic picture of the candidate's competencies, potential for growth, and alignment with the organization's values and strategic direction. This aligns with the DDI assessment framework's emphasis on robust data collection and objective evaluation to ensure fair and accurate identification of talent. It also implicitly supports ethical considerations by aiming for an unbiased and merit-based selection process. An incorrect approach that relies solely on an individual's current performance in their existing role fails to adequately assess their potential for future leadership or more complex roles. This is a regulatory failure, as it deviates from the DDI assessment framework's requirement for forward-looking potential evaluation. Ethically, it can lead to missed opportunities for developing promising talent and can perpetuate existing organizational structures without fostering innovation. Another incorrect approach that focuses primarily on an individual's stated career aspirations without objective validation is also professionally unacceptable. This is a regulatory failure, because it lacks the empirical evidence required by the DDI assessment framework to support assessment outcomes. Ethically, it can lead to misallocation of resources and development opportunities, potentially disadvantaging individuals who may have the capability but not the articulation of their ambitions. Further incorrect approach that prioritizes an individual's seniority or tenure within the organization over demonstrated competencies and potential is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. The DDI assessment framework mandates an objective evaluation of capabilities, not a reward for longevity. This approach can lead to the promotion of less capable individuals, hindering organizational effectiveness and creating a perception of unfairness, which undermines the integrity of the assessment process. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the DDI assessment framework's objectives and requirements. This involves defining the specific competencies and potential indicators relevant to the roles being assessed. Subsequently, a diverse range of assessment methods should be selected to gather comprehensive and objective data. The data should then be analyzed systematically, looking for patterns and evidence that support or refute initial hypotheses about an individual's potential. Finally, decisions should be made based on the aggregated evidence, ensuring transparency and fairness throughout the process, and adhering strictly to the DDI assessment guidelines. Question 4. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client's transaction patterns have significantly diverged from industry norms and previously established risk profiles. The firm's current due diligence assessment is based on historical data. Which of the following actions best reflects a compliant and effective approach to managing this evolving risk? Option A. Dismiss the benchmark analysis as an anomaly and proceed with the current risk assessment without further inquiry. Option B. Initiate a deeper investigation into the reasons for the divergence, seeking additional information from the client and re-evaluating the client's risk rating based on the new findings. Option C. Conduct a cursory review of the benchmark analysis to confirm it falls within acceptable, albeit wider, parameters. Option D. Continue with the existing due diligence assessment, as the historical data remains the primary basis for risk evaluation. The correct answer is B. Initiate a deeper investigation into the reasons for the divergence, seeking additional information from the client and re-evaluating the client's risk rating based on the new findings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a firm to balance the need for efficient risk assessment with the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough and appropriate due diligence. The firm must move beyond a superficial review of existing data and actively seek out new information that could materially impact the risk profile of a client, particularly when benchmark analysis suggests potential discrepancies or emerging risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a proactive and robust commitment to know your customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) obligations. By actively seeking out and analyzing new information that deviates from established benchmarks, the firm is fulfilling its duty to conduct ongoing due diligence and to identify and assess risks in a dynamic environment. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should not rely solely on initial assessments, but should continuously monitor and re-evaluate client risk. The specific regulatory framework for this exam emphasizes a risk-based approach, which necessitates adapting due diligence measures to the evolving risk landscape. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical data without considering the implications of benchmark analysis would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would constitute a breach of regulatory requirements to conduct ongoing due diligence and to adapt risk assessments to new information. It suggests a lack of vigilance and an abdication of responsibility to identify and mitigate potential financial crime risks. Another incorrect approach that involves a superficial review of the new benchmark data without a deep dive into its implications for the client's risk profile would also be a regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a failure to apply a risk-based approach effectively, potentially leading to an underestimation of risk and subsequent noncompliance. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the benchmark analysis as irrelevant without proper justification would be a direct contravention of the principle of continuous risk assessment and adaptation. This demonstrates a disregard for potentially critical risk indicators and a failure to adhere to the spirit and letter of regulatory guidance on risk management. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of regulatory obligations, particularly those related to risk assessment and ongoing due diligence. This involves critically evaluating any new information, such as benchmark analysis, and assessing its potential impact on a client's risk profile. If the new information suggests a potential increase in risk or a deviation from expected patterns, the professional must initiate further investigation and potentially enhance due diligence measures. This process should be documented, and decisions should be justifiable based on the available evidence and regulatory requirements. Question 5. Operational review demonstrates that a client's DDI assessment has generated several red flags related to potential sanctions, screening discrepancies, and adverse media mentions, but the severity and direct relevance are not immediately clear from the automated report. What is the most appropriate next step for the compliance team? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive review of the client's transaction history and conduct targeted searches for corroborating adverse media, while also cross-referencing the sanctions screening discrepancies with the client's known business activities and geographic exposures. Option B. Immediately escalate the client for enhanced due diligence and consider account closure due to the presence of multiple red flags from the DDI assessment. Option C. Disregard the DDI assessment findings as they are not definitive and rely on ongoing relationship manager observations for risk assessment. Option D. File a suspicious activity report, SAR, based on the red flags identified by the DDI assessment, as this indicates a high probability of illicit activity. The correct answer is A. Initiate a comprehensive review of the client's transaction history and conduct targeted searches for corroborating adverse media, while also cross-referencing the sanctions screening discrepancies with the client's known business activities and geographic exposures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the DDI assessment, while intended to identify potential risks, has yielded ambiguous results. The firm must balance the need for thorough risk management with the practical implications of acting on uncertain data. Overly aggressive action based on weak signals could lead to unnecessary resource allocation and client dissatisfaction, while inaction could expose the firm and its clients to significant harm. The challenge lies in interpreting the DDI assessment's output in a way that is both compliant with regulatory expectations for risk assessment and ethically sound in its application. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted review that triangulates the DDI assessment findings with other available information. This aligns with best practices in risk management, which emphasize a holistic view rather than reliance on a single data point. Specifically, it involves seeking corroborating evidence from client interactions, transaction monitoring, and external intelligence. This approach is professionally sound because it demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to understanding the true risk profile of a client. It also allows for a more nuanced and proportionate response, ensuring that resources are focused where they are most needed, thereby fulfilling regulatory obligations to manage financial crime risks effectively without undue burden. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately escalate the client for enhanced due diligence based solely on the DDI assessment's red flags, without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for false positives within DDI tools and can lead to unnecessary disruption for clients, potentially damaging business relationships and wasting firm resources. Ethically, it can be seen as a failure to treat clients fairly and proportionately. Regulatorily, it might be viewed as a superficial application of risk assessment, not demonstrating a deep understanding of the client's actual risk. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the DDI assessment's findings entirely because they are not definitive. This ignores the proactive risk identification that DDI tools are designed to provide. It represents a failure to engage with the firm's risk management systems and could be seen as a deliberate oversight of potential risks. Ethically, it could lead to the firm failing in its duty to protect itself and the financial system from illicit activities. Regulatorily, it would likely be considered a breach of compliance, as firms are expected to act on reasonable indicators of risk. A third incorrect approach is to rely on anecdotal evidence or personal judgment to override the DDI assessment without a structured process for doing so. While professional judgment is important, it must be informed and documented. Relying solely on personal feelings or informal discussions can introduce bias and circumvent the established risk assessment framework. This approach is professionally unsound, as it lacks objectivity and transparency, making it difficult to defend to regulators. It also risks overlooking genuine risks that the DDI tool, despite its limitations, was designed to flag. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach DDI assessment results with a critical yet open mind. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the limitations and intended use of the specific DDI tool. 2. Seeking to corroborate or refute the flagged risks through a structured review of multiple data sources. 3. Documenting the rationale for any decision made, whether it's to proceed with enhanced due diligence, monitor further, or close the alert. 4. Escalating complex or uncertain cases to senior management or a dedicated risk committee for collective decision-making. This systematic approach ensures that actions are risk-based, proportionate, and defensible. Question 6. Upon reviewing the proposed methodology for a new DDI assessment framework, which approach best demonstrates adherence to best practices in ensuring fairness and mitigating bias throughout the evaluation process? Option A. A comprehensive review of the assessment's design, including the selection of criteria, the wording of questions, and the scoring mechanisms, to identify and address any potential for implicit or explicit bias. Option B. An analysis of the demographic representation of individuals who have historically performed well in similar assessments, assuming this indicates the assessment's inherent fairness. Option C. A simple check to ensure that no overtly discriminatory language is present in the assessment materials, without further scrutiny of the underlying structure. Option D. A reliance on the subjective judgment of experienced assessors to interpret results, with the understanding that their intuition will capture any fairness issues. Correct answer is A. A comprehensive review of the assessment's design, including the selection of criteria, the wording of questions, and the scoring mechanisms, to identify and address any potential for implicit or explicit bias. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the assessor to move beyond a superficial understanding of DDI, diversity, and inclusion principles and apply them in a nuanced way to a real-world assessment. The challenge lies in identifying subtle biases that might not be immediately apparent and ensuring the assessment process itself is free from discriminatory elements, even when the intention is to promote inclusivity. It demands a critical eye and a commitment to fairness that goes beyond simply ticking boxes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it actively seeks to identify and mitigate potential biases within the assessment framework itself. By focusing on the process and methodology of the DDI assessment, it aligns with the core regulatory and ethical obligations to ensure fair and equitable treatment. This approach demonstrates a proactive commitment to the spirit and letter of DDI regulations, which mandate not just the outcome of diversity, but also the fairness of the evaluation process. It reflects a deep understanding that true DDI is embedded in how assessments are designed and conducted, preventing unintended discrimination. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by focusing solely on the representation of diverse groups within the assessment results without scrutinizing the fairness of the assessment criteria. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it prioritizes a superficial metric over the integrity of the evaluation. It risks masking underlying systemic biases that might lead to disparate outcomes, even if the numbers appear diverse. Another incorrect approach errs by assuming that the absence of explicit discriminatory language guarantees a fair assessment. This is a failure because it overlooks implicit biases and the potential for assessment tools or methodologies to inadvertently disadvantage certain groups. It neglects the proactive duty to ensure the assessment is inclusive in its design and application. A third incorrect approach is problematic because it relies on anecdotal evidence or subjective interpretations rather than a systematic review of the assessment's design and impact. This is a regulatory and ethical lapse as it lacks the rigor and objectivity required for a defensible DDI assessment, potentially leading to arbitrary or biased conclusions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach DDI assessments by first understanding the specific regulatory requirements and ethical guidelines applicable to their jurisdiction. This involves a systematic review of the assessment's design, including the criteria used, the data collection methods, and the interpretation of results. The focus should always be on identifying and mitigating potential biases, both explicit and implicit, to ensure fairness and equity. Professionals should ask, does this assessment process treat all individuals fairly, regardless of their background? They should also consider the potential impact of the assessment on different demographic groups and be prepared to justify their methodology based on objective evidence and regulatory compliance. Question 7. During the evaluation of a new client application, a financial advisory firm identifies that the prospective client is a prominent individual operating in a sector known for its susceptibility to money laundering, and their stated source of funds involves complex international transactions across multiple high-risk jurisdictions. The firm's compliance officer is reviewing the DDI assessment report. Which of the following actions best reflects a professional and regulatory compliant approach? Option A. Requesting detailed documentation from the client to verify the legitimacy of their business activities, the source of their funds, and the purpose of the transactions, while also conducting independent checks on the client and the involved jurisdictions. Option B. Immediately rejecting the client's application due to the perceived high risk associated with their profile and the jurisdictions involved, without further investigation. Option C. Proceeding with the client onboarding process based on the client's assurance that their business is legitimate and that all transactions are compliant with relevant laws. Option D. Accepting the client based on their prominence and the potential business value, while deferring a more thorough due diligence process until after the initial onboarding is complete. The correct answer is A. Requesting detailed documentation from the client to verify the legitimacy of their business activities, the source of their funds, and the purpose of the transactions, while also conducting independent checks on the client and the involved jurisdictions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for robust due diligence with the practicalities of client onboarding and the potential for reputational damage if a client is unnecessarily delayed or rejected. The DDI assessment in this context is not merely a procedural step, but a critical gatekeeper for ensuring compliance with anti-money laundering, AML, and counter-terrorist financing, CTF, regulations. The firm must exercise sound judgment to identify genuine risks without creating undue barriers for legitimate clients. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, risk-based assessment of the client's activities and the jurisdictions involved. This aligns with the principles of the UK's money laundering, terrorist financing and transfer of funds information on the payer, Regulations 2017, MLR 2017, which mandate a risk-based approach to customer due diligence. By seeking specific, verifiable information about the source of funds and the nature of the client's business, the firm is actively mitigating the risk of facilitating financial crime. This proactive stance demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, safeguarding both the firm and the integrity of the financial system. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the client's stated occupation without further investigation fails to meet the regulatory requirement for enhanced due diligence when red flags are present. This could lead to a breach of MLRs 2017, specifically the obligation to understand the customer and their business. Another incorrect approach that involves immediately rejecting the client based on a perceived, unsubstantiated risk ignores the principle of proportionality and the opportunity to gather more information. This could result in reputational damage and potentially alienate legitimate clients. A third incorrect approach that accepts the client without adequate verification of the source of funds, despite the presence of high-risk indicators, directly contravenes the core tenets of AML/CTF regulations, exposing the firm to significant legal and financial penalties, as well as reputational harm. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with identifying potential risks based on client profile and transaction pattern. This should be followed by a tiered approach to due diligence, applying enhanced measures where higher risks are identified. The process should involve seeking clear, documented evidence to substantiate client information and the source of their wealth. If, after reasonable efforts, sufficient clarity and assurance cannot be obtained, the firm must be prepared to decline the business relationship, documenting the rationale for this decision. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that a firm's DDI assessment process for a new pharmaceutical product launch relies heavily on a single, widely used drug interaction database, with limited independent literature review and minimal consideration for the specific pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic profiles of the drugs involved. The firm's internal policy states that if the database flags an interaction, it is automatically considered a significant risk requiring extensive reporting. Conversely, if the database does not flag an interaction, it is deemed safe. Which of the following approaches best reflects a robust and compliant DDI assessment best practice? Option A. Prioritizing the identification of interactions with well-established drugs and established risks, while giving less weight to potential interactions involving newer or less studied compounds. Option B. A comprehensive review of peer-reviewed literature, clinical trial data, and multiple reputable drug interaction databases, coupled with a critical evaluation of the strength of evidence and a risk-based approach to flagging potential interactions, even when definitive data is limited. Option C. Accepting the pharmaceutical company's internal assessment of drug safety and assuming no significant interactions exist unless explicitly stated by the company. Option D. Sole reliance on the primary drug interaction database, automatically classifying flagged interactions as high risk and non-flagged interactions as safe, with no further investigation. The correct answer is B. A comprehensive review of peer-reviewed literature, clinical trial data, and multiple reputable drug interaction databases, coupled with a critical evaluation of the strength of evidence and a risk-based approach to flagging potential interactions, even when definitive data is limited. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge stemming from the inherent subjectivity in assessing DDI, drug-drug interaction risk, particularly when dealing with novel or complex combinations. The difficulty lies in balancing the need for thorough due diligence with the practical constraints of time and available information. A firm's reputation and client trust are at stake, as is the potential for adverse patient outcomes if critical interactions are overlooked or misjudged. The pressure to provide a definitive assessment quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise the quality of the DDI assessment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a multifaceted, evidence-based methodology that prioritizes patient safety and regulatory compliance. This involves a systematic review of available scientific literature, including peer-reviewed studies, clinical trial data, and reputable drug interaction databases. Crucially, it necessitates a critical evaluation of the strength and relevance of the evidence, considering factors like study design, sample size, and clinical significance. When evidence is limited or conflicting, the best practice involves a conservative approach, flagging potential interactions for further investigation or recommending heightened clinical monitoring. This aligns with the ethical imperative to act in the best interest of the patient and the regulatory expectation of due diligence in risk assessment. Incorrect approach is analysis. Relying solely on a single, generic drug interaction database without critical appraisal represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such databases, while useful, may not always be up-to-date, comprehensive, or nuanced enough to capture the complexities of specific patient profiles or novel drug combinations. This approach risks overlooking critical interactions or overstating minor ones, leading to either patient harm or unnecessary treatment modifications. Accepting a client's assertion that a particular drug combination is safe without independent verification is another critical failure. This demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and an abdication of responsibility for conducting a thorough assessment. It prioritizes client convenience over patient safety and regulatory compliance, potentially exposing the firm to liability. Focusing exclusively on interactions with established, well-documented risks while neglecting potential interactions with newer or less studied drugs is also problematic. The DDI assessment process must be forward-looking and proactive, anticipating potential risks even when definitive evidence is scarce. This approach fails to meet the standard of care and exposes patients to unknown risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and critical approach to DDI assessment. This involves 1. Defining the scope of the assessment based on the specific drugs and patient profile. 2. Conducting a comprehensive literature search using multiple reputable sources. 3. Critically evaluating the quality and relevance of the evidence found. 4. Identifying potential interactions and assessing their clinical significance. 5. Documenting the assessment process, findings, and recommendations thoroughly. 6. Escalating complex or uncertain cases for expert review or recommending appropriate risk mitigation strategies. 7. Maintaining professional skepticism and avoiding reliance on single sources or client assurances without independent verification. Question 9. Consider a scenario where a financial institution is onboarding a new corporate client that operates in a sector known for higher money laundering risks. The sales team is eager to finalize the onboarding process quickly due to the client's substantial projected revenue. The compliance officer is tasked with overseeing the DDI assessment. Which of the following actions best reflects a risk-based approach to DDI in this situation? Option A. Conducting enhanced due diligence, including verifying beneficial ownership and scrutinizing the source of funds, given the client's sector and the potential for higher risk. Option B. Deferring the more in-depth risk assessment until after the client has been onboarded and has begun transacting business. Option C. Relying solely on the information provided by the client in their application form without independent verification to expedite the onboarding. Option D. Proceeding with standard due diligence procedures as outlined for all clients to ensure a consistent and efficient onboarding process. Correct answer is A. Conducting enhanced due diligence, including verifying beneficial ownership and scrutinizing the source of funds, given the client's sector and the potential for higher risk. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the firm's commercial interests with the regulatory obligation to conduct thorough due diligence. The pressure to onboard a new client quickly, especially one with significant potential revenue, can lead to shortcuts that compromise the DDI assessment. The core challenge lies in ensuring that the DDI process is robust enough to identify and mitigate risks without becoming an insurmountable bureaucratic hurdle. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a risk-based methodology, aligning with regulatory expectations for effective DDI. This involves tailoring the depth of due diligence to the perceived risk profile of the client. By conducting enhanced due diligence for high-risk clients, the firm demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, specifically adhering to principles of customer due diligence (CDD) and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. This proactive risk management protects both the firm and the integrity of the financial system. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on speed and efficiency, neglecting to adequately assess the client's risk factors, would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to the onboarding of high-risk individuals or entities involved in illicit activities, violating AML and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) obligations. Another incorrect approach, which involves applying a one-size-fits-all, overly burdensome DDI process to all clients, is also professionally unacceptable. While seemingly cautious, it is inefficient, can deter legitimate business, and may not effectively target resources towards the highest risks, thus failing to meet the spirit of risk-based regulation. Furthermore, relying on outdated or incomplete information during the DDI process is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements for accurate and up-to-date client information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's business, the nature of the proposed relationship, and the geographic locations involved. This initial understanding informs the risk assessment. Based on this assessment, the firm should then apply a tiered DDI approach, escalating the level of scrutiny for high-risk clients. Regular review and updating of client information are crucial throughout the business relationship, not just at onboarding. This systematic, risk-sensitive approach ensures compliance, mitigates reputational damage, and upholds the integrity of the financial services industry. Question 10. The review process indicates that the DDI assessment strategy needs to be re-evaluated to ensure it is both effective in identifying areas for improvement and fully compliant with data privacy principles and ethical considerations. Which of the following approaches best aligns with these requirements? Option A. Implement a voluntary survey that clearly outlines the purpose of data collection for DDI improvement, assures anonymity, and allows participants to opt out of specific questions they feel uncomfortable answering. Option B. Mandate participation in a comprehensive demographic survey that collects highly granular personal data with assurances that the data will be stored securely. Option C. Conduct a series of informal focus groups with a select group of employees to gather general feedback on DDI without formal data recording. Option D. Design a questionnaire that asks broad, subjective questions about workplace culture without requesting any demographic information. The correct answer is A. Implement a voluntary survey that clearly outlines the purpose of data collection for DDI improvement, assures anonymity, and allows participants to opt out of specific questions they feel uncomfortable answering. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in DDI diversity, and inclusion assessments, balancing the need for comprehensive data collection with the ethical and regulatory imperative to protect individual privacy and avoid discriminatory practices. The professional challenge lies in designing an assessment that is both effective in identifying areas for improvement and compliant with data protection principles and anti-discrimination laws. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the assessment process itself does not inadvertently create bias or disadvantage certain groups. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a transparent, voluntary, and anonymized data collection method. This aligns with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that data is collected only for legitimate DDI improvement purposes and is not identifiable. By providing clear explanations of how the data will be used and offering individuals the choice to participate, it upholds ethical standards and respects individual autonomy. This method is also more likely to yield honest and accurate responses, as participants feel secure and informed. An incorrect approach that involves mandatory participation and detailed demographic questions without clear anonymization or a compelling justification for the level of detail risks violating data protection regulations by collecting excessive personal data. It could also lead to a perception of surveillance or discrimination, undermining trust and potentially discouraging participation. Furthermore, if the data collected is not handled with strict confidentiality and security, it could result in breaches of privacy, leading to reputational damage and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on broad, non-specific questions without a clear link to actionable DDI strategies fails to meet the purpose of the assessment. While it might appear to protect privacy, it renders the assessment ineffective and a waste of resources. This approach lacks the depth required for meaningful DDI improvement and does not demonstrate a commitment to understanding and addressing specific DDI challenges within the organization. A further incorrect approach that relies on assumptions or anecdotal evidence rather than structured data collection would be professionally unsound. DDI assessments require objective data to identify trends and inform strategy. Relying on assumptions can perpetuate existing biases and prevent the organization from understanding the true state of its DDI landscape. This approach is not grounded in evidence-based practice and would likely lead to misdirected efforts and limited impact. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, e.g., GDPR if applicable, or local data protection laws, ethical guidelines for data handling, and the specific objectives of the DDI assessment. It requires a risk-based approach, considering potential privacy implications, the likelihood of bias, and the effectiveness of the chosen methodology. Engaging stakeholders, including legal counsel and DDI experts, can help ensure a compliant and effective assessment design. Question 11. Which approach would be most aligned with best practices for conducting a DDI assessment when evaluating an individual's suitability for a role, considering both the need for thoroughness and the protection of personal information? Option A. Conducting a broad and intrusive personal history review, including unrelated aspects of the individual's life, to build a comprehensive profile. Option B. Relying heavily on informal discussions and gossip within the organization to gauge the individual's perceived fit, without seeking formal documentation. Option C. Gathering documented evidence directly related to the role's requirements and conducting targeted interviews to clarify specific competencies, while ensuring all inquiries are proportionate and respectful of privacy. Option D. Dismissing any subjective feedback or personal insights from colleagues, focusing exclusively on objective, quantifiable metrics that may not capture the full scope of the role. The correct answer is C. Gathering documented evidence directly related to the role's requirements and conducting targeted interviews to clarify specific competencies, while ensuring all inquiries are proportionate and respectful of privacy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for comprehensive data gathering with the ethical and regulatory imperative to respect client privacy and avoid unnecessary intrusion. The DDI assessment in this context is not merely a procedural step, but a critical juncture where professional judgment must be exercised to ensure fairness, accuracy, and compliance. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate scope and depth of inquiry without prejudicing the assessment or creating undue burden on the individual being assessed. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a targeted and relevant information gathering process. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that emphasize proportionality and necessity in data collection. By focusing on documented evidence and direct, relevant inquiries, it minimizes the risk of bias, ensures the assessment is based on objective criteria, and respects the individual's right to privacy. This method is ethically sound as it treats the individual with respect and avoids speculative or intrusive questioning. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal information or unsubstantiated rumors would fail to meet regulatory standards for evidence-based assessment. Such an approach is ethically flawed as it can lead to unfair judgments based on hearsay, potentially causing reputational damage and undermining the integrity of the DDI assessment process. Another incorrect approach that involves extensive, unrelated personal inquiries beyond the scope of the assessment would violate privacy regulations and ethical guidelines concerning data minimization. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and an overreach that is both inefficient and potentially harmful. A further incorrect approach that dismisses all subjective input without consideration would also be problematic, as it might overlook crucial contextual information that, when corroborated, could provide a more complete picture, thus failing to achieve a balanced and thorough assessment. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of the DDI assessment and the specific criteria to be evaluated. This should be followed by identifying the most reliable and relevant sources of information, prioritizing documented evidence and direct observations. Any subjective input should be carefully considered for its relevance and corroborated where possible. Throughout the process, professionals must remain vigilant about privacy regulations and ethical considerations, ensuring that all inquiries are proportionate to the assessment's goals and conducted with respect for the individual. Question 12. The evaluation methodology shows that the DDI assessment process is being reviewed. Which of the following approaches would best demonstrate a comprehensive and effective evaluation of the DDI assessment's impact and fairness? Option A. Focusing solely on the increase in the percentage of underrepresented groups in senior management positions. Option B. Measuring the total number of DDI-related training sessions conducted over the past year. Option C. Analyzing a combination of quantitative metrics such as representation across all employee levels and qualitative feedback on the perceived inclusivity and accessibility of DDI initiatives. Option D. Reviewing general employee satisfaction survey results without specific questions related to DDI initiatives. The correct answer is C. Analyzing a combination of quantitative metrics such as representation across all employee levels and qualitative feedback on the perceived inclusivity and accessibility of DDI initiatives. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a firm is implementing a new DDI assessment tool. The professional challenge lies in ensuring the assessment accurately reflects the diverse needs and experiences of all employees, particularly those from underrepresented groups, without introducing bias or creating unintended barriers. This requires a nuanced understanding of DDI principles beyond superficial metrics. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a multifaceted and inclusive evaluation. This involves not only quantitative data on participation and representation, but also qualitative feedback on the perceived fairness, accessibility, and impact of the DDI initiatives. This aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical obligations to foster an equitable and inclusive workplace, ensuring that the assessment truly measures progress towards DDI goals and identifies areas for improvement that benefit all employees. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on demographic representation in leadership roles fails to capture the broader impact of DDI. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it overlooks the experiences of employees at all levels and in various functions, potentially masking issues related to inclusion, belonging, or equitable opportunity within different segments of the workforce. It also risks creating a narrow definition of DDI success, which is not in line with comprehensive DDI frameworks. Another incorrect approach that relies exclusively on employee survey scores regarding general satisfaction, without specific questions about DDI initiatives, is also professionally unacceptable. This represents a regulatory and ethical failure, as it fails to directly measure the effectiveness of the DDI assessment and its intended outcomes. It provides a superficial overview and does not offer actionable insights into how the DDI assessment is being perceived or its actual impact on fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. A third incorrect approach that measures the number of training sessions conducted without assessing their effectiveness or impact is a significant regulatory and ethical lapse. This is a failure because it prioritizes activity over outcome, a common pitfall in DDI implementation. It does not demonstrate whether the training is leading to behavioral change, increased awareness, or a more inclusive culture, thus failing to meet the spirit and intent of DDI regulations and ethical commitments. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of the DDI assessment. This involves identifying key performance indicators, KPI, that are both quantitative and qualitative, ensuring they are aligned with the organization's DDI strategy and relevant regulatory requirements. The next step is to select or develop assessment methods that are robust, unbiased, and capable of capturing diverse perspectives. Continuous monitoring and feedback loops are crucial, allowing for adjustments to the assessment methodology and DDI initiatives based on the data gathered. This iterative process ensures that the assessment remains relevant, effective, and ethically sound. Question 13. The assessment process reveals that while the firm has a comprehensive DDI assessment framework, the practical implementation is proving challenging. There's a tendency to either apply a rigid, one-size-fits-all checklist to every candidate, regardless of their background, or to significantly streamline the process for individuals deemed low risk, without a clear, documented justification for deviating from standard procedures. This has led to concerns about both the thoroughness of assessments for some and the efficiency for others. Which of the following represents the most effective and compliant approach to managing the DDI assessment process in this scenario? Option A. Focus solely on the most commonly identified risk factors from past assessments, creating a condensed assessment that targets only these specific areas for all candidates to improve efficiency. Option B. Continue with the current practice of applying a standardized, exhaustive checklist to all candidates to ensure maximum consistency and minimize any potential for oversight, even if it leads to inefficiencies. Option C. Empower individual assessors to make ad hoc decisions about which assessment components to include or exclude based on their immediate impression of a candidate, prioritizing speed and perceived rapport. Option D. Implement a tiered assessment approach where the depth and breadth of the DDI assessment are determined by a predefined risk profile, with clear guidelines for when and why certain components may be adjusted or expanded, ensuring all critical risk areas are covered proportionally. The correct answer is D. Implement a tiered assessment approach where the depth and breadth of the DDI assessment are determined by a predefined risk profile, with clear guidelines for when and why certain components may be adjusted or expanded, ensuring all critical risk areas are covered proportionally. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common implementation challenge, balancing the need for robust data collection with the practical constraints of time and resources. Professionals must navigate the tension between achieving a comprehensive understanding of an individual's suitability and the efficiency required to conduct assessments within realistic operational limits. This scenario demands careful judgment to ensure that the assessment, while thorough, remains proportionate and effective. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, risk-based methodology. By focusing on key areas identified through initial screening and tailoring further investigation based on emerging concerns, it ensures that resources are allocated efficiently to the most critical aspects of the DDI assessment. This aligns with regulatory expectations for a proportionate and effective assessment process, demonstrating due diligence without unnecessary burden. It also reflects an ethical commitment to conducting assessments that are both meaningful and practical. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a predefined, exhaustive checklist for all individuals, regardless of their profile, fails to acknowledge the principle of proportionality. This can lead to wasted resources and an unnecessarily burdensome process, potentially impacting the efficiency of the overall DDI framework. It may also overlook nuanced risks that a more flexible, risk-driven approach would uncover. Another incorrect approach that involves skipping certain assessment components based on the perceived low risk of an individual, without a documented and justifiable rationale, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This can lead to a superficial assessment that fails to identify potential risks, thereby undermining the integrity of the DDI process and potentially exposing the firm to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to established assessment protocols. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness, leading to rushed interviews or incomplete documentation, is also professionally unacceptable. This approach risks overlooking critical information and failing to form a well-supported conclusion about an individual's suitability. It directly contravenes the ethical obligation to conduct assessments with integrity and diligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory requirements and the firm's internal policies for DDI assessments. This framework should then involve an initial risk assessment to categorize individuals. Based on this categorization, a tailored assessment plan should be developed, allowing for flexibility to delve deeper into areas of concern while maintaining efficiency. Regular review and validation of the assessment process are crucial to ensure its continued effectiveness and compliance. Question 14. The investigation demonstrates that a recent DDI assessment has flagged several areas of potential concern regarding a client's operational resilience, but the findings are described as indicative rather than definitive, lacking specific root causes or quantifiable impact. The firm is now deliberating on how to proceed with the post-assessment actions. Option A. Conclude that the assessment is inconclusive and therefore no further action is required, as the findings are not definitive enough to warrant intervention. Option B. Request a revised DDI assessment report with more definitive findings, delaying any action until a clearer picture emerges. Option C. Immediately implement a comprehensive, firm-wide overhaul of the client's operational resilience framework, assuming the worst-case scenario based on the indicative findings. Option D. Initiate a series of targeted follow-up inquiries and expert consultations to further clarify the nature and severity of the flagged concerns before committing to any remediation. The correct answer is D. Initiate a series of targeted follow-up inquiries and expert consultations to further clarify the nature and severity of the flagged concerns before committing to any remediation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the DDI assessment, while intended to identify potential risks, has yielded ambiguous results that could lead to either over-intervention or under-intervention. The firm must balance the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough assessments with the practical need to avoid unnecessary disruption and cost. The challenge lies in interpreting the nuanced findings and determining the appropriate course of action without overreacting to uncertain data or ignoring potential, albeit unconfirmed, risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, evidence-based, and proportionate response. By conducting further targeted investigations and seeking expert consultation, the firm demonstrates due diligence in understanding the full scope of the identified issues. This aligns with regulatory expectations for robust risk management frameworks, which require not just identification, but also a considered and appropriate response to identified risks. It also upholds ethical obligations to clients and the market by ensuring that actions taken are justified and not based on speculation. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the initial ambiguous findings to implement broad, costly remediation measures would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate principles of proportionality and efficiency, potentially leading to wasted resources and unnecessary client burden, which could be seen as a failure to act with due care and skill. Another incorrect approach, that of dismissing the findings due to their ambiguity without further investigation, would be a significant regulatory failure. This would demonstrate a lack of commitment to the DDI assessment process and a failure to identify and mitigate potential risks, which could expose the firm to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. It would also be an ethical lapse, as it prioritizes expediency over thoroughness and client protection. Professionals should approach such situations by first acknowledging the ambiguity and its implications. The next step is to engage in a structured problem-solving process. Clearly define the specific concerns raised by the DDI assessment, identify potential causes and consequences, and then develop a tiered plan for further investigation. This plan should include seeking clarification from the assessment provider, conducting targeted follow-up inquiries, and consulting with internal or external subject matter experts. The decision-making process should be documented, with clear justifications for each step taken, ensuring transparency and accountability. This methodical approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with both regulatory requirements and professional standards. Question 15. Stakeholder feedback indicates a desire for more concrete data to demonstrate progress on diversity, and inclusion (DDI) initiatives, but concerns have been raised about the feasibility and appropriateness of current data collection methods. The firm is considering a rapid implementation of a broad, quantitative survey across all departments to capture demographic data and self-reported perceptions of inclusion. What is the most appropriate initial approach to address this need for DDI assessment data? Option A. Immediately deploy a comprehensive, company-wide quantitative survey to gather demographic information and inclusion metrics, as this will provide the most immediate and broad dataset for analysis. Option B. Commission an external consultant to benchmark against industry best practices and implement their recommended quantitative assessment tools without significant internal adaptation. Option C. Conduct a phased DDI assessment, beginning with qualitative data gathering through focus groups and interviews with key stakeholders to understand current perceptions and identify specific areas for quantitative measurement, followed by a targeted, well-designed quantitative survey. Option D. Focus solely on readily available HR data, such as hiring and promotion rates, as this is the most objective and easily accessible form of DDI-related information. Correct answer is C. Conduct a phased DDI assessment, beginning with qualitative data, gathering through focus groups and interviews with key stakeholders to understand current perceptions and identify specific areas for quantitative measurement, followed by a targeted, well-designed quantitative survey. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for robust data to inform DDI, diversity, and inclusion assessments with the practical limitations and potential sensitivities surrounding data collection. The firm is facing pressure to demonstrate progress, but the proposed method of data collection is flawed. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the data gathered is both meaningful and ethically obtained, adhering to relevant regulatory frameworks and professional standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a phased, iterative, and consultative method for DDI assessment. This involves clearly defining the scope and objectives of the assessment, selecting appropriate methodologies that are both valid and sensitive, and ensuring that data collection is conducted with informed consent and appropriate data protection measures. This aligns with the ethical obligation to conduct assessments responsibly and the regulatory imperative to ensure fair and unbiased practices. By focusing on qualitative data and expert consultation initially, the firm can build a foundational understanding before potentially introducing more quantitative measures, thereby mitigating risks of misinterpretation or oversimplification. An incorrect approach that relies solely on readily available, potentially superficial quantitative metrics without understanding their context or limitations would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to inaccurate conclusions about the state of DDI within the firm, potentially resulting in misdirected interventions or a false sense of progress. Such an approach risks violating ethical principles of diligence and competence, as it fails to adequately investigate the underlying issues. Furthermore, if the quantitative data is collected without proper consent or anonymization, it could lead to breaches of data privacy regulations. Another incorrect approach that involves immediately implementing a broad, potentially intrusive survey without prior consultation or pilot testing is also professionally unsound. This could alienate stakeholders, generate low-quality or biased responses, and create an environment of distrust. Ethically, this demonstrates a lack of respect for individuals' time and privacy. From a regulatory perspective, poorly designed surveys can lead to data that is not fit for purpose, potentially undermining compliance efforts and leading to flawed decision-making. A third incorrect approach that focuses on replicating DDI assessment methodologies from other organizations without considering the specific context, culture, and existing data infrastructure of the firm is also problematic. This demonstrates a lack of critical thinking and an abdication of professional responsibility to tailor solutions to the unique circumstances. It risks collecting irrelevant data or misinterpreting findings, leading to ineffective strategies and potential regulatory noncompliance if the chosen metrics do not align with the firm's actual DDI objectives or legal obligations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the objectives and constraints. This involves engaging with stakeholders to define success, identifying potential data sources and methodologies, assessing their feasibility and ethical implications, and planning for iterative refinement. A risk-based approach, where potential pitfalls are identified and mitigated, is crucial. This includes prioritizing data privacy, ensuring informed consent, and validating the relevance and reliability of any data collected. Question 16. Performance analysis shows that the current DDI assessment process is experiencing declining employee engagement and a high rate of incomplete submissions, leading to concerns about the validity of the data collected. The DDI Steering Committee is considering several options to address this issue. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for comprehensive DDI insights with employee participation and data integrity? Option A. Significantly increase the length and complexity of the DDI assessment to capture a wider range of demographic and attitudinal data, mandating participation for all employees to ensure comprehensive coverage. Option B. Focus the DDI assessment exclusively on easily quantifiable metrics such as representation numbers, while omitting qualitative feedback mechanisms to streamline the process. Option C. Rely solely on existing HR data and past survey results to inform DDI strategy, discontinuing the current assessment process to reduce the administrative burden on employees. Option D. Implement a phased approach to the DDI assessment, starting with foundational metrics and gradually introducing more detailed modules based on initial findings and strategic priorities, accompanied by clear communication about the purpose and benefits of each phase. Correct answer is D. Implement a phased approach to the DDI assessment, starting with foundational metrics and gradually introducing more detailed modules based on initial findings and strategic priorities, accompanied by clear communication about the purpose and benefits of each phase. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in DDI, diversity, and inclusion assessments, balancing the need for robust data collection with the practical realities of employee engagement and potential for data fatigue. The challenge lies in designing an assessment that is comprehensive enough to yield meaningful insights for strategic decision-making, yet not so burdensome that it discourages participation or leads to superficial responses. Professionals must navigate the tension between the desire for granular data and the risk of overwhelming the workforce, which could undermine the entire DDI initiative. The correct approach prioritizes a phased, targeted, and transparent implementation. This involves clearly communicating the purpose and benefits of the assessment to employees, starting with a foundational understanding of current DDI metrics and then gradually introducing more nuanced data points based on initial findings and strategic priorities. This method aligns with best professional practice by fostering trust, ensuring employee buy-in, and allowing for iterative refinement of the assessment process. Ethically, it respects employee time and privacy by avoiding unnecessary data collection and demonstrating a clear, value-driven purpose. Regulatory compliance is maintained by ensuring data is collected and used in accordance with relevant data protection laws and internal policies. An incorrect approach might involve a big bang rollout of an overly complex and lengthy assessment without adequate preparation or communication. This could lead to low participation rates, inaccurate data due to rushed responses, and a perception of the DDI initiative as an administrative burden rather than a genuine effort to improve the workplace. This approach fails ethically by not respecting employee time and potentially creating a negative perception of DDI efforts. It also risks regulatory noncompliance if data is collected without proper consent, or if the assessment design inadvertently leads to the collection of sensitive personal information without a clear, justifiable purpose. Another incorrect approach could be to rely solely on existing, potentially outdated, or incomplete data without conducting a new, targeted assessment. While seemingly efficient, this fails to capture the current sentiment and experiences of the workforce, leading to decisions based on potentially irrelevant information. This is professionally unsound as it compromises the integrity of the DDI strategy. Ethically, it can lead to a lack of accountability and a failure to address emerging DDI issues. A third incorrect approach might be to focus exclusively on quantitative metrics without incorporating qualitative feedback. This provides a limited view of DDI, missing the nuances of employee experiences and perceptions. Professionally, this leads to an incomplete understanding and potentially ineffective strategies. Ethically, it can overlook the lived experiences of employees, particularly those from underrepresented groups, and fail to foster a truly inclusive environment. The professional reasoning process for this situation should involve a thorough needs analysis, stakeholder consultation, including employee representatives, a pilot phase for the assessment, clear communication strategies, and a commitment to transparency in how the data will be used. Professionals should consider the principle of proportionality, collecting only the data that is necessary and relevant to achieve the DDI objectives. Question 17. Operational review demonstrates that a recent firm-wide diversity and inclusion (DDI) assessment achieved a 98% completion rate within the mandated 2-week period. However, anecdotal feedback from team leaders suggests that many employees rush through the assessment, providing brief or generic responses, and that a significant portion of the workforce did not fully grasp the assessment's purpose or how their feedback would be utilized. Considering the goal of using the assessment to identify actionable areas for DDI improvement, which of the following approaches would best address this implementation challenge and ensure the assessment's effectiveness? Option A. Accept the high completion rate as a success metric and proceed with analyzing the existing data, while simultaneously planning for a future, separate training program on DDI concepts to be delivered in the next fiscal year. Option B. Initiate a follow-up communication campaign that reiterates the importance of the DDI assessment, provides additional resources for understanding its objectives, and offers a voluntary, extended period for employees to revisit and refine their responses, emphasizing that the goal is quality feedback for positive change. Option C. Conduct a series of mandatory, one-on-one interviews with a sample of employees who provided brief responses to probe their understanding and motivations, using this information to retroactively adjust the interpretation of the overall assessment data. Option D. Immediately launch a new, more rigorous DDI assessment tool that includes mandatory essay questions and requires manager sign-off on employee responses to ensure deeper engagement and accountability. Correct answer is B. Initiate a follow-up communication campaign that reiterates the importance of the DDI assessment, provides additional resources for understanding its objectives, and offers a voluntary, extended period for employees to revisit and refine their responses, emphasizing that the goal is quality feedback for positive change. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in DDI diversity and inclusion assessments. The tension between achieving broad participation and ensuring the quality and depth of the data collected. A firm-wide mandate for completion can lead to superficial engagement, where employees rush through the assessment without genuine reflection or understanding of its purpose. This can result in unreliable data, undermining the very objectives of the DDI assessment, which are to identify areas for improvement and foster a more inclusive workplace. Challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive data with the need for meaningful and accurate input. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a phased rollout with integrated training and clear communication of the assessment's purpose and benefits. This strategy acknowledges that DDI assessment is not merely a data-gathering exercise, but a critical component of cultural change. Providing training ensures employees understand the concepts, the importance of their honest feedback, and how the data will be used constructively. A phased approach allows for iterative refinement of the assessment tool and communication strategy based on early feedback, mitigating the risk of widespread misunderstanding or disengagement. This aligns with best practices in change management and ethical data collection, ensuring that the assessment is perceived as a tool for positive development rather than a bureaucratic hurdle. It respects the employee's time and intellectual contribution by equipping them to provide valuable input. Incorrect approaches analysis. Mandating immediate, firm-wide completion without adequate preparation or context is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It breaches the principle of informed consent, as employees may not fully understand what they are agreeing to or how their data will be used. This approach risks generating inaccurate and biased data, which can lead to flawed DDI strategies and potentially discriminatory outcomes, violating principles of fairness and equity. It also signals a lack of respect for employees' contributions, potentially fostering cynicism and resistance to future DDI initiatives. Focusing solely on quantitative completion rates without considering the quality of responses or employee understanding overlooks the qualitative aspects crucial for effective DDI. This can lead to a false sense of progress while genuine issues remain unaddressed. Ethically, it is misleading to report high completion rates as indicative of successful engagement when the data's integrity is compromised. This approach fails to uphold the responsibility to gather data that is both reliable and representative, which is fundamental to any evidence-based DDI strategy. Implementing the assessment with a focus on individual performance metrics rather than collective improvement shifts the perception from a shared organizational goal to a personal accountability exercise. This can create anxiety and discourage honest self-reflection, particularly if employees fear negative repercussions. It undermines the collaborative spirit essential for DDI and can lead to employees providing socially desirable answers rather than their genuine perspectives, thus compromising data validity and the assessment's effectiveness. This approach is ethically questionable as it may inadvertently penalize individuals for expressing honest feedback. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with implementing DDI assessment must adopt a strategic, employee-centric approach. This involves understanding that successful DDI initiatives are built on trust, transparency, and genuine engagement. The decision-making process should prioritize 1. Purposeful communication. Clearly articulate the why behind the assessment, linking it to organizational values and tangible benefits for all employees. 2. Empowerment through education. Provide necessary training and resources to ensure employees understand the concepts and the assessment's importance. 3. Phased implementation and feedback. Roll out the assessment in stages, allowing for adjustments based on feedback to optimize the process and tool. 4. Data integrity over quantity. Prioritize the quality and accuracy of responses, recognizing that meaningful insights are more valuable than superficial completion. 5. Ethical data handling. Ensure confidentiality, anonymity where appropriate, and transparent use of data for constructive purposes. This framework ensures that DDI assessments are not just compliance exercises, but catalysts for meaningful organizational change, grounded in ethical principles and professional best practices. Question 18. System analysis indicates that a large financial institution is planning to implement a comprehensive DDI assessment across its entire global workforce simultaneously. The proposed assessment involves a lengthy online survey and mandatory participation for all employees, with results intended to inform future diversity and inclusion strategies. What is the most professionally sound approach to implementing this DDI assessment? Option A. Proceed with the immediate, mandatory, and comprehensive rollout of the assessment to all employees to ensure timely data collection for strategic planning. Option B. Focus exclusively on collecting quantitative data points through automated HR systems, as this is the most efficient and objective method for DDI assessment. Option C. Conduct a pilot assessment with a representative sample of employees to gather feedback on the survey's clarity, length, and overall experience before a full-scale rollout. Option D. Outsource the entire DDI assessment process to an external consultancy without significant internal involvement, relying on their expertise for design and execution. The correct answer is C. Conduct a pilot assessment with a representative sample of employees to gather feedback on the survey's clarity, length, and overall experience before a full-scale rollout. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in DDI, diversity and inclusion assessments, balancing the need for comprehensive data collection with the practicalities of employee engagement and the potential for data fatigue. The professional challenge lies in designing an assessment that is both effective in identifying areas for improvement and sustainable in its ongoing application without overwhelming the workforce. Careful judgment is required to ensure the assessment is perceived as valuable and not merely a bureaucratic exercise. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a phased, iterative implementation. This allows for initial feedback and refinement, ensuring the assessment tool is well received and its outputs are actionable. By focusing on a pilot group, the organization can identify potential issues with data collection methods, survey fatigue, or the clarity of questions before a full-scale rollout. This aligns with principles of good project management and change management, minimizing disruption and maximizing the likelihood of successful adoption. Ethically, it demonstrates respect for employees' time and engagement by seeking to optimize the process. From a regulatory perspective, while specific DDI assessment regulations may vary, a well-designed and implemented assessment contributes to a fair and equitable workplace, which is a common underlying objective of many employment laws and guidelines. An incorrect approach that relies on a single, comprehensive, and mandatory rollout without prior testing risks significant employee resistance and disengagement. This could lead to incomplete or inaccurate data, undermining the entire purpose of the assessment. It fails to acknowledge the potential for survey fatigue, a known issue that can diminish response rates and data quality. Ethically, this approach could be seen as inconsiderate of employees' workload and potentially coercive if participation is perceived as non-negotiable without clear justification or benefit. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on quantitative metrics without qualitative insights would provide an incomplete picture. DDI is multifaceted, and while numbers are important, understanding the underlying reasons for those numbers through qualitative feedback is crucial for developing effective strategies. This approach would fail to capture the nuances of employee experience and could lead to misinterpretations or the implementation of superficial solutions. It misses the opportunity to foster a deeper understanding of diversity and inclusion within the organization. A third incorrect approach that outsources the entire assessment process without internal buy-in or clear communication channels would also be professionally unsound. While external expertise can be valuable, a lack of internal ownership and understanding can lead to an assessment that is not tailored to the organization's specific context or culture. This can result in a disconnect between the assessment findings and the organization's ability to implement meaningful change, rendering the exercise less impactful. It also misses the opportunity to build internal capacity and knowledge regarding DDI assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the organization's goals for the DDI assessment, an analysis of potential employee impact, and a consideration of best practices in data collection and change management. It requires a phased approach, starting with clear objectives, followed by careful design, pilot testing, iterative refinement, and a well-communicated rollout strategy. Engaging stakeholders at all levels is crucial to ensure buy-in and to gather diverse perspectives that will inform the assessment's design and implementation. Question 19. Operational review demonstrates that a prospective client, a large financial institution, has significant deficiencies in their data governance and data privacy controls, which are critical components of a robust DDI framework. The firm's business development team is eager to secure this client, as they represent a substantial revenue opportunity. During the DDI assessment debrief, the lead assessor is pressured to present the findings in a way that minimizes the severity of these issues to avoid jeopardizing the potential deal. What is the most appropriate course of action for the lead assessor? Option A. Focus the presentation on the client's strengths and areas of compliance within the DDI framework, while downplaying the severity of the data governance and privacy deficiencies, and suggesting that these can be addressed through future, less urgent initiatives. Option B. Present the DDI assessment findings accurately and objectively, clearly articulating the identified gaps in data governance and privacy, their potential impact, and the necessary remediation steps, even if it means highlighting areas that require significant investment from the client. Option C. Immediately propose a comprehensive suite of expensive DDI solutions and services that the firm offers, framing them as essential to address the identified weaknesses, without fully detailing the specific root causes or the client's capacity for implementation. Option D. Suggest that the DDI assessment be revisited at a later date, after the client has had an opportunity to implement some preliminary improvements, to avoid presenting a negative initial report that could deter the client from engaging the firm. The correct answer is B. Present the DDI assessment findings accurately and objectively, clearly articulating the identified gaps in data governance and privacy, their potential impact, and the necessary remediation steps, even if it means highlighting areas that require significant investment from the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the firm's desire to secure new business and the ethical obligation to provide an objective and unbiased assessment of a potential client's DDI capabilities. The pressure to impress a prospective client, especially one with significant potential revenue, can create a temptation to overlook or downplay deficiencies. However, the DDI assessment framework mandates a rigorous and truthful evaluation, irrespective of commercial interests. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the integrity of the DDI assessment process and upholds the firm's professional duty of care. By clearly communicating the identified gaps and their implications, the firm demonstrates transparency and a commitment to providing actionable insights. This aligns with the DDI assessment's core principle of enabling informed decision-making for the client, even if it means highlighting areas requiring substantial improvement. This approach fosters trust and long-term credibility, which are essential for sustainable client relationships. An incorrect approach that involves glossing over significant DDI weaknesses to present a more favorable initial impression would be a direct violation of the DDI assessment's ethical guidelines. This constitutes a failure to act with integrity and objectivity. Furthermore, it misleads the client about their current state, potentially leading to poor strategic decisions and future reputational damage for both the client and the assessing firm. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately recommending expensive, unproven solutions without a thorough understanding of the root causes identified in the assessment, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a potential conflict of interest, prioritizing revenue generation over the client's genuine needs. This also undermines the credibility of the DDI assessment itself. Professionals should approach such situations by first adhering strictly to the DDI assessment methodology. This involves a systematic and evidence-based evaluation. When challenges arise, the decision-making process should involve 1. Reconfirming the findings against the established assessment criteria. 2. Consulting internal guidelines or senior colleagues if there is ambiguity or pressure to deviate. 3. Prioritizing clear, factual communication of findings to the client, focusing on the implications and potential risks associated with identified gaps. 4. Framing recommendations as solutions to address specific, identified weaknesses, rather than generic offerings. Question 20. Implementation of a new DDI, due diligence investigation, process has revealed significant undisclosed risks associated with a long-standing, high-revenue client's portfolio. The client's relationship manager is aware of these findings and is concerned that disclosing the full extent of the risks will lead to the client terminating their business relationship, impacting the firm's revenue significantly. The relationship manager is considering presenting a sanitized version of the DDI report to the client, highlighting only minor issues and downplaying the severity of the major concerns. What is the most appropriate course of action for the relationship manager? Option A. Inform senior management of the DDI findings and request guidance on how to proceed, without directly disclosing the full report to the client until a strategy is agreed upon. Option B. Immediately cease all communication with the client and withdraw services without providing any explanation of the DDI findings to avoid potential conflict. Option C. Present the full, unredacted DDI report to the client, clearly explaining all identified risks and their potential implications, and discuss strategies for mitigation. Option D. Present a summary of the DDI report to the client, focusing on positive aspects and only briefly mentioning minor risks, while omitting the most critical findings. Correct answer is C. Present the full, unredacted DDI report to the client, clearly explaining all identified risks and their potential implications, and discuss strategies for mitigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to retain a valuable client and the advisor's duty to provide objective, unbiased advice. The advisor must navigate the pressure to downplay negative findings to preserve the relationship, while upholding their fiduciary responsibility to act in the client's best interest. This requires a high degree of integrity and a clear understanding of regulatory expectations regarding disclosure and client welfare. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes transparency and client protection, aligning with the core principles of financial advice by clearly communicating the risks associated with the DDI assessment findings, even if it jeopardizes the client relationship. The advisor demonstrates adherence to regulatory requirements that mandate full disclosure of material information. This upholds the client's right to make informed decisions based on accurate and complete data, fulfilling the advisor's ethical obligation to act with diligence and care. An incorrect approach that involves omitting or minimizing the negative DDI assessment findings would constitute a serious regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the principle of full disclosure, potentially misleading the client about the true nature of their investment or financial position. Such an action could lead to significant financial harm for the client and expose the advisor and firm to regulatory sanctions, including fines, disciplinary actions, and reputational damage. Furthermore, it breaches the duty of loyalty and good faith owed to the client. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately terminating the relationship without a thorough discussion, an attempt to mitigate the issues, might be seen as an overreaction or a failure to explore all avenues to assist the client. While protecting oneself from potential liability is important, a professional should first attempt to guide the client through the challenges identified by the DDI assessment, offering solutions or alternative strategies where feasible, before considering disengagement. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the core ethical and regulatory obligations. 2. Gather all relevant facts and assess their implications. 3. Consider the potential impact on the client's financial well-being and objectives. 4. Evaluate different courses of action against these obligations and potential outcomes. 5. Prioritize transparency and client best interests, even when difficult. 6. Seek guidance from compliance or legal departments if uncertainty exists. 7. Document all decisions and communications thoroughly.